During his time with the Eagles, Bernie Leadon contributed to the band by shaping their early sound with his great ear for harmony and his heavy influence of country, bluegrass, and folk music style. He was a multi-talented instrumentalist who could play just about anything with strings. Without a doubt, he was a huge contributing factor to the sound that would help get the band signed to a record deal and start them out on the road to success. But the Eagles shifted gears and started to veer off that road after a few albums. And what usually ends up as a disaster for most bands only took them faster and farther. But sadly, it left Bernie behind. But it was more than just the music that caused him to leave. A lot more. So let's get right into it and see if we can shed a little light on it, especially from Bernie's side of the road. Bernie Leadon was born in 1947 in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His father was an aerospace engineer, and the family moved around the United States a lot. They ended up in California when Bernie was a teen, and it was there he met many musicians and started honing his talents on anything with strings and really getting into the acoustic style of music. The family then moved to Gainesville, Florida, where Bernie was to meet Don Felder, and they would strike up a solid friendship. Both boys playing guitar, with Don a more rock and blues player, and Bernie a bluegrass and country style player. The boys got along well, and even though the differences in music style, Bernie joined up with the group Don was in called the Monday Quintet. But the music scene in Florida was nothing like California, and it wasn't long till Bernie packed up his car, tried to talk Don into going with him, but ended up heading west alone and back to California in 1967. After arriving, he joined a country folk group called Hearts and Flowers. The group didn't last long, and after recording one album, they broke up in 1968. Bernie then joined the group Dillard and Clark, and after recording an album with them, he quit in 1969 to join the Flying Burrito Brothers with his friend Chris Hillman and Graham Parsons. Hillman and Parsons were writing some good songs, and the country rock scene was starting to take shape on the West Coast. After recording a few albums, Bernie was to again quit the group and move on. A quick note here about the Flying Burrito Brothers. Graham Parsons, who was an integral piece to the band, was to really start the party scene when the band did some opening shows with the Rolling Stones. And Keith Richards decided Graham was a fun companion to party with. A few have said this was the start of his downfall that would eventually lead to Graham's death of an overdose of tequila and morphine in 1973. Bernie, who was now playing with the Flying Burrito Brothers and had played a short time with Linda Ronstadt a little before that, while Linda was starting out and looking for a record deal. Now she had producer John Boylan helping her look. In 1971, she needed to put a band together, so her and Boylan went to work. After getting Don Henley to play drums, her next choice was Bernie to play lead guitar. But since he was with the Burrito, she decided to ask Glenn Fry, who was friends and writing partner with J.D. Souther, who Linda was living with at the time. Glenn needed the work, so he accepted to play guitar, but Linda still wanted Bernie, and John Boylan went to him and asked Bernie, and he accepted. Randy Meisner was also to join them. Linda said when the band would practice over at her and J.D.'s place, you could tell there was something there. She said the voices blended well together. Don had told Linda that they were going to try and keep this band going after the tour, and Linda, who was looking for a recording contract, totally understood. Bernie seemed to be real happy with the band. He had an equal say in the group and was writing and playing the style of music he loved. But that all started to change after the Desperado album. The first two albums were produced by Glenn Johns and recorded in London. Both albums made good use of Bernie's talent on guitar, banjo, mandolin, steel guitar, dobro. The group basically split up the lead vocals among the four of them on the first album. The second album, Desperado, did not fare as well on the charts, and for their third album, the band decided to move a little more away from the country rock feel and more to the rock and roll side. Glenn Johns only produced 2 songs for that album, one being Best of My Love, their first #1, and then they brought in Bill Szymczyk and started recording back in California. Things were really starting to change in the band around this time. Don Felder was brought in to give the band a true rock guitarist. Don and Glenn, along with J.D. Souther and Jackson Browne, were writing more songs, which didn't leave much room on an album for Bernie or Randy's songs, and the band was starting to really party their brains out. Bernie was becoming more unhappy with the way things were going. You can't blame him. His roots were in folk, bluegrass, and country music. He was a good guitarist, but his strength was in those styles, not the rock directions the Eagles were heading, and I'm sure he could see the writing on the wall. And Bernie wasn't one to hide his feelings too well. He was very headstrong. When the Eagles were formed, it was supposed to be 4 members, with all 4 having a say-so in the group and its music. By this time, that was about over, and Glenn and Don Henley were taking over the band and its direction. Bernie says, they were pretty pushy, honestly, but producer Glenn Johns kind of created the balance that exists on the first 2 albums. When after he left, the whole dynamic changed, and then pretty soon, Don and Glenn had written all the hits, so it did become the Don and Glenn Show. With the change in producers and music, the well-documented arguments between the band, and a factor not many talked about, but Bernie had been changing a little over the years. It was time for Bernie to dump the can of Budweiser over Glenn and leave. Bernie's change I'm talking about is he started to live a cleaner lifestyle. He was getting away from the harder drugs and had cut way back on his drinking and took on a healthy eating and just a cleaner, healthy lifestyle altogether. And this could not work with a band who worked and partied as long and as hard as the Eagles did. I do think, had Bernie really wanted to, he could have been a solid part of the band musically into the following years. But in my opinion, I think he was just tired of it all and done. He could have fit in musically had he wanted, but I do not think he could change who he had grown into. Now, this is my opinion only. If you have one, please feel free to share it in the comments section. One of Bernie's final songs with the Eagles was I Wish You Peace, written by him and his girlfriend Patty Davis, was really a good song. It's on One of These Nights album, and it's worth checking out, a well-written song. Don Felder said in his book Bernie took off and went to Hawaii. But he came back after a bit and tried his hand at an album in 1977 with the Bernie Leadon and Michael Georgiadis Band, and released the album National Progressions. Bernie got Glenn Johns to produce it, and he did a good job. But, same as I said in my Don Felder video about Don's solo album, I'll say the same about Bernie's. The vocals are buried. The songs on the album are well written, and the music is good, and all in all, it was a good album to listen to. But as far as making it to the charts, well, it just didn't do well. As good of a producer as Glenn Johns was, he can only do so much. Give it a listen and let me know what you think about it. Bernie moved on, and in the 80s he was back with his old friend Chris Hillman for a pair of releases, 1982's Morning Sky and 1984's Desert Rose, and form a Christian bluegrass group, Ever Call Ready, who issued a lone self-titled release in 1985. 2 years later, Bernie replaced John McEwen in the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band, appearing on the recordings of Hold On in 1987, Working Band in 1988, and Will the Circle Be Unbroken Volume 2 in 89. In the 1990s, Bernie and Russell Smith from the Amazing Rhythm Aces launched the novelty act Run C&W, which specialized in doing country versions of rap songs, and issued 2 releases, 1993 Into the Twangy First Century, and in 1995 Roe vs. Wade. Right after that, Bernie was elected into the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, along with the other members of the Eagles in 1998. One person Bernie thanked was John Boylan, Linda Ronstadt's manager, for asking him into the original group. Then, in 2003, Bernie released a solo CD, Mirror. Now this album I thought was fantastic. One of the best songs I think from the album is What Do I Own? Give it a listen and check it out, the whole album. I think this is the best work Bernie ever did after leaving the Eagles. Now here's a spark from this album. There is a producer-player on it named Ethan Johns, who just so happens to be the son of producer Glenn Johns. Remember him from the earlier in the video? A lot of good players and singers on Mirror, including Emmylou Harris. I just can't say enough about it. I wasn't too fond of the first one Bernie did back in '77, but this one he hit a home run on, in my opinion. Bernie moved from California to Nashville around 1990, and he now lives on a 300-acre farm. He spends a lot of time working on sessions besides his own projects. As far as his time in the Eagles, Bernie says, "I don't regret any of it. It was a great time in my life, but everything since then has been great too." What's funny is that a year after I left, they did wind up taking a long break. Earlier in the video, I had mentioned it was more than just the music causing the problems, but you can see the grinding schedule was also wearing on Bernie. Eagles books often say that Bernie was unhappy that the band was moving away from their country rock sound, and that could be true, but he disputes this notion. Here's what he had to say. "That's an oversimplification," he said. "It implies that I had no interest in rock and blues or anything but country rock. That's just not the case. I didn't just play Fender Telecaster, I played a Gibson Les Paul, and I enjoyed rock and roll. That's evident from the earlier albums." If Bernie regretted one thing, it was pouring the beer over Glenn, which he got in touch with Glenn years later and apologized for. And Glenn accepted. In 2013, he was asked to join back up with the Eagles and do the History of the Eagles tour. After doing that a few years, he was asked if he'd ever play with them again, and this is what he had to say. "We'll never say never, right? Interestingly, when the 2.5 years of touring was over, the last show, Glenn Frey gave me a big hug and said, 'It's not over.' And I went, 'Okay, cool, man. Let's talk about it.' Glenn's not here, so that can't happen. Honestly, I don't really see it happening unless it's just a one-off or a special occasion kind of thing. I don't think it will, but never say never. I'm good friends with all the guys." Last I heard, Bernie was living out on his farm just outside of Nashville and was happy. He said he still writes songs and might even do another album someday. Bernie's 75 years old now and seems to be taking life easy. There's no doubt that Bernie was a musical force out on the West Coast back in the days of the country rock scene. I'm not saying he's underrated, but he flies under the radar a lot. That Eagles Greatest Hits album, 71 through 75, is the best-selling Eagles album of all time. A big part of that album's success is Bernie Leadon. I'll just leave it at that. Hope you enjoyed this video on Bernie Leadon. If you did, you know the routine. Smash the like button, share the video, and if you haven't subscribed, I sure wish you would. I have a bunch more videos on the channel you might like. Have any thoughts or anything to add, please feel free to do so in the comments section. Thank you all for watching.